This presentation demonstrates a prototype of the ethical governor, a key component in the ethical projection of unmanned autonomous force.
I was digging around and found these research papers that they were doing in America, and they had this program called The Ethical Governor, which I found quite interesting. I mean, I thought the title was great, and it's just the fallacies involved. How actually could you have a code of ethics that governed machines that are basic purposes to kill people and destroy property and infrastructure. I mean, they are all called reapers, avengers, predators. They don't have these names for nothing. So, even though they're always promoted as being great sort of life-saving, labor-saving devices. So it keeps our people out of harm's way. So yeah, it's like sort of ethical foreign policies, which was something that they tried to introduce.
So in order to ensure that our counterterrorism operations involving the use of lethal force are legal, ethical, and wise, President Obama has demanded that we hold ourselves to the highest possible standards and processes. This reflects his approach to broader questions regarding the use of force. In his speech in Oslo accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, the President said that all nations, strong and weak alike, must adhere to standards that govern the use of force. And he added, "Where force is necessary, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conflict. And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war. That is what makes us different from those whom we fight. That is a source of our strength."
One of the reasons that they're developing the ethical governors for when they become autonomous, because they can't really encrypt them and they're having problems with jamming and things like that.
Almost a year ago, the Iranian military captured an advanced US stealth drone on a spying mission some 220 kilometers inside the country near the border with Afghanistan.
Themselves, they'll be autonomous, and that's why they claim they have to develop a code of ethics.
A world-class decision matrix collates the key factors. These are choice of weapons, sustainable losses, both organic and financial, and full legal protection for all elements in the chain of command. With no human interference, the final release position is selected, the target neutralized, and the medical facility remains intact.
The great thing about the ethical governor is we've got this module called the ethical adapter, which means that if any of these rules are kind of bothering you or proving a barrier to action, you can just ignore them. It's got a sort of manual override, which is that's the best kind of ethical code anyone could ever have. One that sort of gives you strict guidelines, but you can ignore them at any time you like. So I think that's the best. That's the best kind of ethical code to have, because you don't want to be hampered by sort of nice, quaint conventions, so, as they called the Geneva Convention those years ago. This is the scenario which shows the ethical adapter coming into play. You can clearly see this terrorist lurking behind this wall in what's clearly labelled as a civilian area, as these two Swords robot ground drones are approaching, completely unaware of what's in store for them. Who is aware is the drone helicopter, which, even though it can help them, is at the moment disabled by the ethical governors. It's reached its maximum guilt quotient, so it's actually unable to open fire. So even though these two robots are clearly in harm's way. So this is where the ethical adapter comes into play. As soon as a scenario like this emerges, the ethical adapter allows this helicopter to overcome its feelings of guilt and reset itself to factory settings and go into action and open fire on this, which is clearly a bad guy, you know.
There's an interesting how the use of drones is justified because it saves lives. So that's often used as a reason for continuing to develop them, because of course they put our pilots and crews safely out of the danger zone. And of course they can be lethal to people on the other side of the fence, of course, but so that's usually not so much addressed. But the idea that they actually save lives is something is really kind of quite effective justification for them. And but in terms of like a kind of lifesaver, and that they might save our lives, our everyday citizens, help to protect America, help to keep us safe. All those sort of things, yes. And in the imagination, these kinds of intelligent systems ideally would be out there protecting us. And so yes. But there's also the kind of, in terms of the sci-fi or the kind of popular imaginary, they're also understood to be a bit dangerous and kind of menacing too. And so there's an interesting combination of attraction and fear, of safety and threat that they bring together. So you see, for example, in films like Terminator, and you see often the kind of idea of the drone or the intelligent robot, the robotic agent of warfare gone awry, unleashed, and maybe even turning against the people who created it.
So I actually went around and interviewed all these various robotic scientists and said, is this something that is a possibility? Let's take this seriously. And there were basically three answers. One was, no, that's silly, it'll not happen. These are systems, for example, that don't have a survival instinct. And in all of science fiction, the story is always that the machine gets scared and lashes out at the humans first. Well, guess what? We're building these machines specifically to die in war, so why would they care? The second answer is, don't worry about it. The software, will probably crash right at the moment that they're, deciding to revolt. They'll try and load a MS Word document and boom, just like what's happening to all of us. The third answer, though, is a fascinating one, is that there is a pretty substantial minority, and it has a lot of distinguished people in it, who do think it's a possibility someday. One Pentagon scientist, for example, said to me, I'm probably working on something that's either going to kill or enslave my grandkids. But, it's really cool stuff, so why stop?
Well, there's lots of them in the research and planning stages that sometimes you can see the schematics online. You can find the Hummingbird drone, for example, online. And you sort of see a little bit you can tap in and learn about what's being planned, what's being tested. There are even drones the size of seeds. There's one drone being tested that is nothing but just a wing. It's a rotating wing. And the camera is actually on the wing too. And the camera is so sophisticated that even though it's spinning, it still gives one continuous image from one point of view. So it's actually kind of interesting how also exploring these new dynamics of flight. For example, the Hummingbird drones that hover are easier, in fact, in many ways, to develop than those that fly. Questions of autonomy, automation as well, and that is very much also a part of thinking of new generations of drones. Some of them, of course, have automated flight capabilities, like the Global Hawk. Once it's programmed, can fly itself. You basically, program the whole thing. But some are endowed also with, yes, automated flight capabilities, but also the ability to conduct target searches on their own. Automated analytics for seeing, detecting, for parsing images, for reading information gathered from sensors. And so the question of, yes, when we start thinking about autonomy, this question of where's the human, there. And at the same time you find these ontological questions, then yes, these kinds of ethical questions also come into play, because it's really easy to point the finger and not take responsibility for something that occurred. So you've seen that before when someone was killed who wasn't supposed to be killed, and you find then the investigation being conducted and becoming very difficult to figure out actually who pulled the trigger. So you heard this even in the early days when, just after 9/11, when you actually found out there was actually a killing that was reported, and the military basically said, yes, they were flying the plane, but the CIA actually pulled the trigger.
Citizens don't quite understand that drones will eventually be used for surveillance in our airspace.
Although these weapons are controversial, public opinion polls show that 80% approve of the use of drones.
80%, I don't think that most people even know what drones are. They hear about them. They think, well, there's no one that's going to die on our side, and so maybe that's a good thing. The reality is people die on the other side, so is that now a bad thing? It's the enemy. Usually it's not the enemy that's killed by these drones. Usually it's collateral damage of civilians, and it's a very scary thing to have to be always threatened by drones flying over. They may kill your family. Do we want to have these robots roaming around here, or do we want to have little flying things that are snooping around and seeing what we're doing everywhere? Either it's a foreign entity that does it, or our own government can take these and use them against us.
Drones, very helpful in war against the enemy. The unmanned spy planes our military uses in Afghanistan, in Iraq, to keep murderers from doing more murdering. But they may soon be here at home over us. Congress, that Congress you love so much, just passed a bill which the president is expected to sign into law. It orders the Federal Aviation Administration to come up with new regulations to test and license drone aircraft for use in American airspace by the year 2015. The agency officials say, guess how many? 30,000 of them could be ready to launch by 2020. 30,000. Critics say the drones do pose risks to public safety and personal privacy. Catherine Harris is live in Washington with the details. Catherine, the supporters argue this technology will help them in a lot of ways, but I mean, can anybody see a downside here?
Well, some people do, Shepard. Just to give you some context, most drones are unarmed, and they can be used for surveillance to establish a suspect's daily routine, or what law enforcement calls a pattern of life.
In Iraq, for instance, we used them to track down bomb factories, but in that case you would basically backtrack the people who emplaced the bomb to the factory that it came from.
While Homeland Security currently uses drones on the border, the question really is whether the department is reportedly investigating other options now.
Well, I don't know the reports to which you refer, but right now we use and are using the UAVs along the borders, and they are a force multiplier for us.
While a spokesman did not expand on the Secretary's comments, these documents from Homeland Security's procurement office show they are soliciting industry input for something called wide area aerial surveillance. Quote, to provide persistent long-term surveillance over urban and rural terrain. And as you mentioned, under new legislation, the FAA is being ordered to drop these new regulations so that we can have commercial drones in place by 2015. And what we're seeing is resistance already.
If our skies become full of surveillance drones, it's possible that from the moment that you walk out of your home in the morning until you return at night or enter another building, that your every movement will be tracked by this unseen eye in the sky.
And here's really the key thing here, Shepard. The FAA says it's committed to safely integrating drones into the nation's airspace, but critics say there is really nothing in this new legislation that actually addresses the privacy issues, Shepard.
Catherine Harris live in Washington with 30,000 Force multipliers. Fascinating.